Welcome everybody to the discussion section lecture video for week 6. In this particular video, we're going to review those graphs from chapter 9. And that's the part of the chapter that I think most students tend to have trouble with. So we're going to review them, we're going to answer a few practice questions about them, and then hopefully by the end of this video you can answer those discussion session questions for your activity for this week. Right, so with that in mind, remember that the first market that we talked about was the resource market, where we talked about the most common resource, which was labor. So remember, this works just like the market for goods and services. We just have a different name for the price of labor. We call it the wage rate, and a different name for the quantity of labor. We call it the employment level. And for each one of these graphs, you want to know why the curve is sloped the way that it is. So the reason why we have a downward sloping labor demand curve is because remember that firms demand labor, and there's an inverse relationship between how much labor they're willing to employ and the price at which they're willing to employ that labor. So firms are willing to employ more labor at lower wages and less labor at higher wages. And remember that workers or individuals supply that labor, and the reason why that supply curve is upward sloping is because there's a direct or positive relationship between the wages that people earn and the amount that they are willing to work. So workers are more willing to work for higher wages and less willing to work for lower wages. All right, so let's go ahead and graph out that labor market. Right. With that in mind, again, all these curves or graphs are going to look relatively similar, just with a different name for price and quantity. So again, if we're talking about the resource market in particular, focusing on the market for labor, right, you're going to have wage being measured as the price of labor and employment being measured as the quantity of labor. And again, you're going to have an upward sloping labor supply curve, looking something like that, and then a downward sloping labor demand curve, looking something like that. And then where the two intersect, you have an equilibrium employment level. That's where the people looking for work is equal to the amount of jobs available at the equilibrium wage rate, which is the wage rate that brings the quantity of labor demanded equal to the quantity of labor supplied. Right, so that's what your resource or labor market looks like. Again, upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, just a different name for price and quantity. Call the price of labor the wage, and the quantity of labor employment. Right, so the mechanics of the graph work the same, but be able to answer a question about that graph. For example, this one here, it says, suppose the economy has dipped into a recession and firms are producing less than usual, resulting in a lower desire to hire workers. How will this affect the equilibrium rate, wage, and employment level? Right, so again, if we're going back to this graph, we have a decrease in the desire of firms to hire people due to the fact that we're in a recession. So remember that, as we talked about back in our original slide here, it says that firms are the ones who demand labor, and so if they have a decreased desire to demand that labor, then that's going to be a decrease in the labor demand curve, right? Which, if you remember, all decreases are going to be shifts to the left. So you're going to see the labor demand curve decrease or shift to the left, so we'll call that DL2. When that happens, that's going to cause the employment to go down, which is something that tends to happen during those recessions, and the wage to go down, something else that tends to happen during those recessions. Right, so you're going to see lower wage and lower employment level. Right, remember they both move in the same direction as demand. That rule doesn't change. Right, so with that in mind, the answer you'd be looking for on this one is both equilibrium employment and wages will decrease. You're looking for choice D there. Right, so again, if the economy dips into a recession and firms are producing less, they're going to have a lower demand for labor. That's going to cause wages and employment to go down, which is something that tends to happen during those recessions. All right, so again, be able to answer a question like this come exam time. Another thing we talked about was the loanable funds market. Remember, the price of loanable funds is the real interest rate. That's the price you receive when you lend money out to somebody else. It is the price that you pay when you borrow money from somebody else, right? So that is the price of loanable funds, right? And the quantity of loanable funds is the amount saved and invested, right? So again, in a loanable funds market equilibrium, the quantity of savings should equal the quantity of money that people will borrow. Now, when it comes to what that demand curve represents, right, remember that that demand curve represents the desire to invest or borrow money for the purposes of investment, and people tend to borrow money at lower interest rates and or borrow more money at lower interest rates, and they'll borrow less money at higher interest rates. So again, there's that inverse relationship between the amount that people are going to borrow and then the interest rate they're going to have to pay for those loanable funds. When it comes to that upward sloping supply curve, right, remember that comes from the idea that people will save more money when they get a higher interest rate for doing so, and they'll save less money when they get a lower interest rate for doing so. So again, there's that direct or positive relationship between the amount people are willing to save and the interest rate that they're going to receive. Right, so let's go ahead and graph that out. So again, we're going to our loanable funds market. It's going to have a similar vertical and horizontal axis. It still measures price and quantity, only now we're talking about the price and quantity of loanable funds. Again, the price of loanable funds is the real interest rate, which we abbreviate with that R, and the quantity is the amount saved and invested. And again, we have an upward sloping supply curve that represents those savings. That says that people will tend to save more at those higher interest rates and save less at lower interest rates. And then we have that downward sloping demand curve, which again represents people's desire to invest, which usually refers to the desire to borrow money for the purposes of investing. And remember, the reason why it's downward sloping is people like to borrow more at lower interest rates and will borrow less when they have to pay back those higher interest rates. Now, where the two intersect, you got that equilibrium quantity of money being saved and invested. And again, there's an interest rate that makes that quantity of savings equal to the amount that people want to borrow. Right. Okay, so moving on, the next practice question with regards to this graph, it says the idea that people will borrow more money at lower interest rates results in a, so we're talking about borrowing more as interest rates go down, right? Again, that's that demand curve that we referred to earlier, right? That's that inverse relationship between the amount that people want to borrow and the rate at which they'll borrow it, right? So when interest rates are really high, like say 15%, the quantity of money being borrowed or invested, that should be QI, for that's the quantity of money that's being borrowed for the purposes of investment, right? That is going to be lower, so we'll call that QI1, right? Then when, say, the interest rate is lower, maybe at like, say, 3%, when you only have to pay back that low 3% rate, you're probably going to be willing to borrow a lot more. You might take out a lot more money for a house or student loans if you had to pay back a 3% interest rate and if you had to pay back a 15% interest rate. So the quantity of money being borrowed for the purposes of investment is going to be a lot higher. Again, there's that inverse relationship between the interest rate and the amount people are willing to borrow. Right, so the idea that people will borrow more money at a lower interest rate results in a downward sloping demand curve, and in this case, it's in the loanable funds market, because we're talking about the relationship between interest rate and the amount being borrowed. Right, if we're talking about wages and employment, then we might be in the labor market here, but again, we know we're talking about the demand curve because it's that inverse relationship, and we know we're talking about the loanable funds market because we're talking about those interest rates. So let's continue on. The market that gives people, I think, the most trouble is the foreign exchange market. So remember that the price in the foreign exchange market is the price of foreign currency, and the quantity in the foreign exchange market is the quantity of foreign currency. Remember that the demand curve represents imports plus capital outflows, right? Think about why we want foreign currency: to buy things from other countries, which is what we call imports, or to invest our money into other countries' banks and businesses, which is what we call capital outflows. So it makes sense that as the dollar appreciates, or as the dollar can buy more of that foreign currency, people can import more and invest more in other countries. Right now, the supply of foreign currency, or where we get foreign currency, that comes from exports plus capital inflows. Right, so whenever we sell our goods to other countries abroad, they might pay us in their foreign currency, and that's how we get it. Or if those people in other countries want to invest in U.S. banks and businesses, they might invest by, again, using their foreign currency, and we could get it that way. So as the dollar depreciates or can buy less of that foreign currency, that's another way of saying that that foreign currency appreciates, then people in foreign countries are going to buy more from the United States or export more, or cause the U.S. to export more, and will be more likely to invest that money in U.S. banks and businesses, or in other words, increase those capital inflows. So let's go ahead and graph that out. So once again, this graph is going to start out looking pretty much the same as it always has. that vertical axis and that horizontal axis. And we're still going to be looking at price, only it's the price of foreign currency, and quantity, although in this case it's going to be the quantity of foreign currency. And you're still going to have that upward sloping supply curve. Just remember that that supply curve now represents this idea of where we get foreign currency when we sell goods abroad and they pay us in their foreign currency. That's exports, or when people invest in U.S. banks and businesses, or what we call capital inflows. And then we have a downward sloping demand for foreign currency. So again, this is supply of foreign currency. This is demand for foreign currency. And again, think about why we want foreign currency: to buy goods from other countries, which we call imports, or to invest in those foreign banks and businesses, which we call capital outflows. And then where the two curves intersect, you have your equilibrium quantity of foreign currency. That's where the amount of foreign currency being demanded is equal to the amount of foreign currency being supplied. And there's an equilibrium price of foreign currency, or equilibrium exchange rate, that will make that happen. Right. Now, again, the one big thing I want to make sure that you know is that as you move along this vertical axis, right, again, how you interpret this is maybe a little bit different. As you go up this vertical axis, right, that is the idea that the foreign currency is appreciating, which is another way of saying that the US dollar will depreciate. And as you move down this vertical axis, again, that is the foreign currency depreciating, and that is the dollar appreciating. Because remember, we're measuring that foreign axis as that vertical axis as the price of foreign currency, right? So again, as you move down it, that's the foreign currency depreciating or becoming cheaper. As you move up it, that's the foreign currency appreciating or becoming more expensive. So let's go ahead and try to answer a question here, or a practice question based off of this graph. This one says, if there is a decrease in the desire of U.S. citizens to purchase goods and services from other countries, right? So again, that's a decrease in the desire of U.S. citizens to import goods, and a decrease in the desire of U.S. citizens to invest in foreign banks and businesses, or a decrease in those capital outflows, then how would this affect the foreign exchange market? Right, so again, it's telling you here that we have a decrease in the desire of U.S. citizens to purchase goods and services from other countries. Right, so in other words, our desire to import has gone down, and our desire to invest in those foreign banks and businesses has gone down. So it looks like we're talking about a decrease in the demand for foreign currency. So when the demand for foreign currency decreases, again, that is a shift to the left. Call that demand for foreign currency 2. And where that intersects the old supply curve, that gives us a new quantity of foreign currency, call that QFC2, and a new equilibrium price for foreign currency, call that PFC2. And again, this is the idea that our price of foreign currency has gone down, right? It's another way of saying that the dollar has appreciated. So we know that the quantity of foreign currency has decreased and that the value of the dollar has appreciated. Right, so that's the answer you want. You want the equilibrium quantity of foreign currency would decrease and the US dollar would appreciate. So it looks like C is the answer you're looking for on that one. Right, so again, that one you gotta be a little bit careful about just in terms of how you interpret that vertical axis or moving along it. But make sure you pay close attention to that and you should do okay on the test. And then the final market that we talked about was the aggregate goods and services market, where price is the price index or price level and the quantity is real GDP. Remember that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping because that's the idea that people are going to buy more of all goods at the lower price levels for all goods and less of all goods at higher price levels for all goods. So again, at lower prices, people buy more. At higher prices, people buy less. We talked about in the lecture video 3 reasons why that's true. Make sure you know those 3 reasons. For the short run aggregate supply curve, right, remember that it says that there's going to be a direct or positive relationship between the price level and the amount people are willing to produce, because higher price levels will increase a producer's profitability. So producers will produce more as price increases and less as price decreases. Again, in the lecture video, we kind of explained why this is true, but basically the idea is that in the short run, which is what we're measuring with the short run aggregate supply curve, Producers can raise the price but still keep their costs held down by contracts that don't expire for a while and therefore increase their profits when prices go up. Now, the long run aggregate supply curve is going to be vertical because it does not depend on price at all. Right? Higher prices will increase costs as much as revenues, so there's not going to be any change in profitability. So in the long run, all those contracts that were being held down in the short run, right, those contracts are now up for renegotiation. People see that prices have increased, so they're going to negotiate for higher wages or higher leasing agreements, right, things that are going to raise costs as much as revenues to the point where it's not going to affect profits at all. So that's why your long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. So again, know why these three curves are shaped the way that they are. Right, so let's go ahead and graph out our aggregate goods and services market. Right, so again, you're going to have a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we're measuring price index, and on the horizontal axis, we're measuring that real GDP. Right, remember that real GDP is everything in that C plus I plus G plus NX equation that we talked about in Chapter 7. So remember, we got that upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. Again, in the short run, higher prices will increase a firm's profitability. So the higher the prices, the more they're going to want to make. Then you're going to have that downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Because again, people like to buy more at these lower prices. They don't like to buy as much at higher prices. Now, where those two curves intersect, that is a short run equilibrium unless the long run aggregate supply curve is also intersecting there. And if that is the case, if you have a long run aggregate supply curve that looks like this, ours is right there where those other two curves intersect. And remember, that's vertical because in the long run, that increase in prices will increase costs as much as revenues to the point where it's not going to change the profitability of the firm at all. But if all three of those curves intersect at the same point, we call that a long run equilibrium, which we abbreviate with a capital E. Right? Remember that the short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve, where they intersect, is going to give you the actual output. The long run aggregate supply curve gives you your potential output or your output at full employment, which we abbreviate as Y superscript F. So if all three curves are intersecting at the same point, then again, Y is going to be equal to YF, or our actual output is equal to our potential output. That means that there's no recession or no expansion there. And again, this is the equilibrium price index that makes that happen. All right, so that's what the aggregate goods and services market looks like. So if you want to answer a question like this, a vertical long run aggregate supply curve indicates that. And the answer you're looking for here is that an increase in the price level will not expand an economy's output capacity in the long run. Right, so with that in mind, if you're wondering why that's true, again, if the price index is, say, 100, or if a price index is, say, twice that, 200, again, prices have doubled over the time period that we're talking about here, it's not going to affect the long run aggregate supply curve or our potential output. It's going to be the same regardless. Right, so again, our long run aggregate supply curve is that vertical, perfectly inelastic curve that does not change at all relative to those price changes. Right, so again, the answer you're looking for here is A, an increase in price level will not expand an economy's output capacity in the long run. Right, that stays the same. Right, that potential output, or Y superscript F, doesn't change no matter what happens to price. Right, so keep that in mind when you're answering a question like that on the exam. Right. All right, so that is the four main graphs that we talked about in chapter 9, and those are some practice questions so that you can help so that you can kind of get an idea of how those questions might be formed on the exam. Again, you want to know what the price and quantity for each of these markets are. You also want to know why these curves are all sloped the way that they are, so the idea or theory behind that. And then again, if something were to happen that makes one of these curves shift, be able to tell me what happens to that equilibrium price and quantity. So if you can do all that, then you should be good to go for, again, what I believe is the most graphically intense part of the course. Right. So if you got all that, then go ahead and try it on your own by completing that discussion session assignment for Module 6. As always, you can just let me know if you have any questions. Shoot me an email or come visit me in those Zoom office hours, and I'll be happy to go through these graphs with you and answer any questions that you might have. Again, go ahead and give that discussion session assignment a shot. See if you can get this stuff on your own. Right, again, you will see questions like this on your quizzes and exams. So I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you need anything, and take care.